Greetings and salutations, my gory groupies. Your abominable buddy, Sugar Pants, is here with another gruesome goodie. 1970s, I Drink Your Blood. A sanguine shindig about rabid, devil-worshipping hippies and the small town they terrorize. Fun fact, this title was the very first movie the MPAA gave an X rating to based on violence alone. So with that luscious lead-in, let's list off that sleaze docket and find out what the ratings board found so despicable. We have 22 dead bodies, 1 dead dog, 1 dead goat, 1 actually slaughtered chicken, 10 cups blood, 1 syringe of rabid dog blood, 6 naked breasts, 7 naked butts, 2 naked dongs, 1 naked woman fruit platter, 2 cut feet, 1 shotgun-blasted rabid dog, 1 legectomy, 1 electric knife handectomy, 1 strangulation, 1 wooden spike impalement, pitchfork to the throat, 1 self-immolation, 1 decapitation, 1 chewed throat, 1 noose-snapped neck, 1 disemboweling, 1 sword impalement, 1 shotgun blast to the face, repeated knife to the chest, car won't start as soon as there's trouble cliche, 1 all-rat barbecue, blood splatter pendulum, 1 LSD dosed grandpa, nasty hippie meat pie dinner scene, 1 ear-assaulting soundtrack, and sexually transmitted rabies. Whew. Well, let's fucking go! Whoa, hang on a second. Was this made by a 7-year-old Quentin Tarantino? Or maybe a 2-year-old Robert Rodriguez? Our movie begins proper with a shot of this naked dude leading a satanic sermon. This is Horus.
Let it be known to all the spirits that I am a Capricorn.
Oh, great, so he's an asshole. And that sword handle ain't covering up nearly as much as I think it should. He proclaims to be Satan's firstborn son, and not one person feels like fact-checking this one. He plops some drugs into a communal goblet, and everyone partakes, except for the woman serving as the buffet table. Meanwhile, there's an onlooker watching from the trees. Out comes a chicken sacrifice, and they actually kill the bird on camera. And then they ruin the fruit buffet with his blood. Suddenly, they spot the girl watching their sermon, and they chase after her. Andy steps up to say he invited Sylvia along, and Horace slaps him for bringing in an outsider. Cut to the next morning where Mildred and Pete are loading up the car when they notice Sylvia staggering towards them before collapsing. Mildred tells Pete to get his grandpa, and he takes off. Meanwhile, the hippies are having car trouble. Perhaps they need a,
Satanic mechanic.
The crew piles out next to the Valley Hills town sign showing the population has plummeted from 4,000 to 40. Not suspicious at all. Shelley is still asleep in the back of the van, so the rest of the group push it into the ravine and have a hearty laugh at his expense. What a swell group of friends. Sylvia comes to just as Doc Banner arrives. Unfortunately, he's just a veterinary doctor, so he's not sure how much help he can be. Whatever happened has put Sylvia in shock, and she's not able to tell him what went on. Mildred has to go up to the damn construction site and takes her leave. Up at the site, she runs into Roger and says that she's certain it was one of his crew that assaulted Sylvia. He asks how she's so sure, and she replies that there's no one else left because of the construction. He says he'll do what he can, but he says investigating a rape is a little outside of his domain. Before she leaves, Mildred gets the crew's doctor to check on Sylvia. The hippie crew are looking around at the prospects of setting up in a ghost town, and Shelley questions Horace's leadership, which earns a slap across the face and a threat of skinning him alive. Just then, Sylvia, Pete, and the doctor, who's smoking, arrive back at the family bakery. Horace goes in and lays on the charm. He says they're a rock group and are stranded due to car trouble. Well, yeah, that'll happen when you push it into a fucking ravine. When asking what food is available, he points out that his pregnant wife needs a place to rest. Mildred says the hotel's been closed and boarded up for a while, and the rest of the abandoned houses are due to be torn down in a few weeks. Horace pays for the food and leaves. Pete follows them outside with a distrustful look on his face, and Horace tells Sue Lynn that they have their pick of any abandoned house. They trudge to the closest one and smash their way inside. Pete yells out that it's not safe to go in there because it's haunted and full of rats. Horace laughs and says they'll have a rat barbecue, then tells his crew that whoever catches the most rats will be supreme ruler for the night. Cut to the montage of the animals chasing rats through the house. And I'm not at all convinced they didn't actually use dead animals for this scene. Rollo wins the contest and is given the power to do anything he wants for the night. He does his best to impersonate Horace's earlier sermon, but with his own flair for the dramatic. Suddenly, Sylvia wakes up screaming, and Grandpa gives her her prescribed medication. She says she's ashamed of what happened, but Grandpa says that's more reason she should tell him everything. She starts by saying she caught Andy stealing a chicken, but we cut away before she can finish. Back with the hippies, Shelley is held down and marked as a pig. Sue Lynn slices both of his feet, and Shelley passes out. They hang him from the rafters and swing him around, splattering the group with his blood. After hearing the story, Grandpa takes off with his shotgun to confront the hippies. Pete tries to warn him that there's too many, but Grandpa tells the boy to stay with his sister. At the abandoned house, Grandpa barges in on the bloodletting ceremony, and Horace cancels the fun. He tells Grandpa that they're a theatrical group rehearsing a performance, and then asks if he plans on actually using that shotgun. He says he plans on doing so because of their group beating up young girls. Andy immediately calls Sylvia out by name, but before he can call them outside, Horace smashes his glasses, snatches his gun, then sucker punches him in the gut. The blonde girl, who's not given an actual name in the movie, licks his face and doses him with LSD. Pete calls out to him from outside, and Sue Lynn says they better let him go before they get into some real trouble. Blonde girl goes out to seduce the boy? Pete threatens to get the construction crew's security involved, and Horace chases after him. Molly and Blonde Girl tell him to leave the boy alone, and they turn Grandpa loose so Pete can help him back to the house. Sylvia comes down to ask what happened, and shames Pete for not being hip to the drug scene.
He's not drunk, stupid. He's been doped. Huh? With that stuff that they call LSD. The whole bunch take it.
What does it do, that L, whatever you call it?
Boy, you really don't know anything.
She helps Grandpa to bed, and Pete angrily loads a shotgun with the conveniently placed kitchen ammo. What? Didn't you have a bullet drawer in the kitchen when you were a kid? Trudging through the woods, Pete tracks down an angry, growling dog and puts it down. Sylvia asks him what he did, and he tells her he took a shot at a rabid dog that's been snooping around. But when asked if he killed it, Pete lies and says he thinks he just scared it off. Meanwhile, Andy is carrying Shelley downstairs. Molly says he wouldn't do the same for him, but Andy says if he dies, they are all responsible. Horace says they'll just dump him because he was a troublemaker who no one will miss. Pete makes his way to Grandpa's clinic and loads up on some serious hardware before heading out to the dead dog. Using the equipment, he withdraws a syringe full of blood and runs back home. Next morning, Mildred is getting the bakery ready for the day and takes a fresh batch of meat pies from the oven. Pete volunteers to help her with chores and suggests she make an extra dozen pies for the hippies. Once alone, Pete uses his syringe to fill a batch of meat pies with the rabid dog blood. And as luck would have it, here come the assholes just in time for breakfast. At first, they're reluctant to have a meat pie for breakfast. I mean, they're hippies, not Aussies. But Pete offers them a discount on a dozen that they can't walk away from. Sylvia is taking care of Grandpa and mentions that Pete saw a rabid dog last night. He says he has to file a report about it and calls the bakery to get the details. Mildred asks why he never said anything about it, and Pete says he killed it. On the road, Pete asks Sylvia what happens if a human gets rabies.
They go insane and die.
Cut to breakfast with the crew. But Andy's a picky eater and walks away from the table. We're then treated to a sloppy, smacky, slobbery hippie dinner. And a reminder that Shelley isn't partaking due to his foot injuries. Andy takes off to ask Sylvia how she's doing and apologizes for what happened, but she's not so quick to forgive. She then asks why he got involved with a satanic crew, and he said, for kicks. He then tries to convince her it's all for show. Cut back to Horace holding a gun to Rollo's head. He pulls the trigger, but the chamber was empty. He then fires a bullet into the awning. The crew talks about how hot it's gotten and that they're all feeling pretty bad since breakfast. Rollo suggests that the meat pies were bad because of how quick they were to sell them. Horace says they're getting back at them for what they did to Grandpa and says they'll wreck the bakery in retaliation. Molly says if they're sick they'll be in no mood for shenanigans, and then Horace puts the gun to her belly and fires. Thankfully, it was another empty chamber. Up at the dam, Roger is screaming at one of his employees about material deliveries being delayed. Mildred says she doesn't feel safe in town, but Roger says he's too busy to escort her back home. She angrily tells him the construction is more important to him than she is, and tells him to drop dead before heading off. Meanwhile, the hippie crew is in pretty bad shape, groaning and sweating like crazy. Sue Lynn is reading tarot cards and draws death, while Rollo watches. She lays the card on Shelley's chest and hands a knife to Rollo. Andy wakes up just in time to watch Rollo stab Shelley a dozen times before chasing Andy out the door. Out in the woods, he comes across a giant axe and gleefully takes it. Horace wakes up to find Shelley's body. He rattles off a short sermon and Rollo takes a swing at Sue Lynn, narrowly missing. Molly fires the gun at him and he turns his attention back to Shelley and cuts off his leg. Suddenly, Blonde Girl ain't having a blast like she was before and takes off screaming. Rollo grabs the severed leg and taunts her with it until she takes off into the night. Horace plays around with the fresh blood while Sue Lynn makes a slow retreat. Mildred is still driving home long after night has fallen and notices Andy in the middle of the road. He jumps out of the way, but Mildred just keeps on driving. She comes to a stop and Horace immediately jumps onto her car with his sword. She gets back in and speeds down the road. Eventually, she makes it to the Banner household and asks to use the phone. Andy also makes it to the house at the same time and asks if Sylvia can help him. She gives him some food and tells him to wait in the barn. Roger finally gets his shit together at the construction site and calls the bakery, but no one's answering. So he tells Ed, one of his crew, to take a few of the men and drive into town to check on things. First to see if Mildred is okay, then to check out the old hotel for the hippies. Roger gives the leader his handgun, just in case. Sylvia finally gets out to the barn and asks Andy what's happened. He says Rollo killed Shelley and then came after him. He wonders if he should go to the police, but he's afraid he'll be in trouble if he does. Mildred shows the bloody handprints on her car to Grandpa, who takes a sample. Out on the road, Blonde Girl runs into the construction crew who are more than happy to give her a lift. They make it back to the hotel, and Ed tells the men in back to check on it while they go to the bakery. Unfortunately, a squealing, wooing blonde girl convinces the men there's nothing inside and that they can have a lot more fun outside with her. Ed sees the bakery locked up tight and the lights out, so they go back to the hotel. At first, all they see are rats and evidence that people are living there, but the other worker puts his hand in a puddle of blood and wants to leave. Ed insists he stay and help him check out the upstairs. Horace drops a noose from the rafters and loops it around Ed's neck, killing him instantly. Frothing at the mouth, Horace stabs the worker in the belly when he goes for Ed's gun. And apparently Andy's feeling okay about his lousy situation because it's time for a roll in the hay with Sylvia. At least until they hear someone approaching. Oh, it's just Pete who's convinced Andy is Rabid. That's when he confesses his plan with the Rabid meat pies, but Andy swears he's not contaminated. Sylvia asks if he has any idea what he's done, but all he's worried about is being in trouble with Grandpa. Back at the hotel, we see the afterglow of a raucous gangbang. Men hooping and hollering and zipping their pants back up. They pile into the truck and take Blonde Girl with them, not at all concerned by the lack of Ed and the other worker. Grandpa's in his office looking over the blood sample when Pete rings the doorbell. He convinces Roger that Mildred is okay and says he needs to tell him about a threat to the entire community. The crew makes it back to the construction site's living quarters and offer up Blonde Girl as the evening's entertainment. Grandpa tells Roger that the man who attacked her has rabies and then gives us a basic rundown of the disease, that it's highly communicable and symptoms, including fever and the panic-inducing fear of water, can manifest almost immediately. That's when we cut back to the party where Typhoid Mary here is sexually transmitting rabies to the crew. In a panic, she runs off to the showers, where one angry patron shows off his scratches, then douses her in the shower. Then Grandpa says rabies death depends on the individual's constitution, as they're mentally reduced to an animal's mind, enraged by the color red, and find a hunger for flesh. Then he concludes by saying the hippies being jacked up on illegal drugs is definitely making things worse in unthinkable ways. That's when we catch up to Molly and Carrie, who are being taken in by one of the residents in town. The lady offers to make them some food and slices up some ham. Carrie becomes fascinated by the electric knife and uses it to cut off the lady's hand while Molly runs off screaming. Roger is approached by the company doctor, who says there's a hell of a lot of trouble and leads them to Blonde Girl's corpse. That's when they make it back to the construction barracks to find a rabid crew armed with clubs and machetes. Roger drops one of them with his shotgun, but a dozen others chase after them. Fortunately, splashing water in their direction stops their pursuit. Horace makes it to a tourist trap and finds him a pretty python to play with. The old coot who owns the place runs out in his jammies, and Horace kills him. Somehow. Andy, Sylvia, and Pete are wandering in the woods for some reason and come across an army of rabid construction workers. That's when they find Molly leaning up against a tree. He informs her that the whole crew is infected and she begs them for help, but they say it's hopeless and take off. She sobs for her unborn baby and finds a conveniently placed dog leash spike. She pulls it out of the ground and runs herself through. The trio makes it to the quarry just as Rollo passes through. He attacks, but runs away when he sees the water. Back in town, Sue Lynn is standing in the parking lot with a dagger. Roger blocks her with his car and runs to Mildred. He tells her to stay inside and lock up while he goes for help. Sylvia and the others make it back home safely, but they find Grandpa in the barn with a pitchfork through his throat. Sue Lynn is looking pretty bad as Mildred starts barricading the bakery. She grabs a can of gasoline and starts pouring it all over. Horace sees her from a distance and chases towards her with his sword, but before he can attack, she sits in the circle of gas and flicks her lighter. Fucking hardcore. Just then, everyone makes it back to the town square. Rollo chases after our trio, but instead decides to have it out with Horace. Sword and axe clash in a fight that honestly isn't the worst choreography I've seen. Our trio bangs on the door to the bakery, but Mildred doesn't let them in. The rabid construction workers show up, and their panicked pleas only make them sound more dangerous. Andy is decapitated right when Mildred opens the door to let Sylvia and Pete inside. Rollo gets the upper hand in the fight and impales Horace with his own sword. Mildred takes the kids into the basement as the crew breaks their way in and tears up the place. One breaks through the basement door, but Mildred blows its fucking face off. Now that their safety is compromised, they take off and run right into Rollo. He gets his hands on Mildred's shotgun, but she's able to fight him off with the water hose long enough to get into the car, but not before one gets his mouth around her wrist. And of course, the car doesn't start, even though there's been absolutely no prior evidence of vehicle trouble. The car is swarmed and actually turned upside down, but fortunately that's when the police show up and just fucking shoot anyone standing. Roger shows up to tell them there may be a woman in that car, and only then does he order the shooting to stop. Roger goes to check if anyone's alive, and the bakery porch looks like a fucking war zone. Thankfully, Pete, Sylvia, and Mildred are okay. They're loaded up into an ambulance and taken away. Dr. Oates here tells Roger that at least the poor bastards have been put out of their misery, as death by hydrophobia is agony. We then roll the credits as we watch Pete, armed with a handgun, walking off into the dark woods in the distance. The end. Oh boy, what an assault on the senses. Not so much the violence and schlock, I mean the soundtrack. Oof, that is some deep hurting right there. I strongly suggest keeping the volume turned down on this one, as Clay Pitt's soundtrack is definitely a character in and of itself. That's probably why you'll hear it in other places, like Rob Zombie's music, for example. Most of the cast have only a handful of credits to their name and nothing very high profile. However, Elizabeth Marner Brooks, who played Mildred, also played Barb in The Deadly Spawn. Alex Mann, who played Shelley, was in Microwave Massacre, and voiced Jimmy the Grape in the video game The Darkness. And then there's Lynn Lowry, who played the mute girl Carrie in her first acting gig ever. She's got 128 acting credits, including a ton of stuff that's in the works as of this recording. Unfortunately, one of those roles was the witchy woman Zia in Necropolis Legion. And I'm not going to rip open that festering wound of mine. It's finally started to scab over and is producing a lot less pus these days. For what it's worth, Lynn was also in the original 1973 The Crazies, as well as the 2010 remake. Well, kiddos, that clock on the wall says it's time to say goodbye for now. It's always a little sad when the episodes conclude, but never fear, my loathsome lot, for that basket bunch of beastly beauties is always filled to the brim. That's a fancy way of saying there's always more trash to review. So until I greet you next time, this is your old pal Sugar Pants. See you in your dreams.